The right engine changed its note at 35,000 feet. Nobody heard it. 212 people. Headphones in. Eyes closed. Coffee cooling in plastic cups. Not one of them heard what the man in seat 5A heard, the fractional shift in frequency that meant something inside that engine was already dying. He heard it. He wrote it down on a napkin. Then he folded the napkin, put it in his pocket, and told himself it was not his problem. He was wrong about that last part. 40 minutes later, the captain was unconscious. The first officer was alone. And somewhere over Montana, a failing aircraft full of strangers was about to find out that the most dangerous man on board wasn't the one everyone had been afraid of since the moment he walked through the door. He was the one they'd been trying not to look at. The one with grease still on his hands. Darnell Booker did not sleep the night before the flight. Not because he was nervous. He was never nervous. He just had a fuel injector seal that refused to cooperate, a client in Fairbanks who needed the part by Tuesday, and a workbench that had seen more of him than his own bed had in the past 3 weeks. He finished at 2:47 in the morning. He washed his hands twice. Still had grease under his nails. Under the knuckles too, the kind that lives in the cracks and doesn't come out no matter what you do. He looked at them under the bathroom light for a moment. Thought about washing them a third time. Decided against it. The flight left at 6:10. He packed the parts in a hard case wrapped in foam he cut himself because the foam the supplier sent was never the right density. Loaded it into his truck. Drove to Hartsfield in the dark, Atlanta still sleeping around him. The highway empty in a way it never was during daylight hours. He liked Atlanta at 4 a.m. It was the only time the city felt like it belonged to people like him. He parked, checked in, made it through security with the hard case after explaining twice what was inside and once signing something he didn't read carefully enough. Gate C14. He found a seat near the window and watched the planes move on the tarmac. Big slow machines in the dark. Ground crews with orange lights. The particular careful rhythm of people who understand that the margin for error in their work is exactly 0. He understood that rhythm. He had lived inside it for 10 years. Darnell Booker spent a decade in the United States Air Force as a flight engineer. Not a pilot. That distinction mattered, and he would be the first to make it. Pilots flew the aircraft. Flight engineers understood them. Every system, every sound, every tremor in the airframe that meant something was working, and every tremor that meant something was about to stop. He had sat in jump seats behind men with thousands of hours in the air and told them things their instruments hadn't told them yet. He was good at it. He was very good at it. Then he left, came home to Atlanta with a toolkit, a lease on a small space in Vine City, and the idea that he could build something of his own. Booker Aviation Services, 3 bays, 2 employees, 1 contract at a time. The Fairbanks job was the biggest he'd landed in 3 years. Not because it was complicated, because it paid enough to cover 6 more months of the loan he was still paying on the equipment. He needed this trip to go smoothly. He needed to get there, hand over the case, get the signature, and come home. That was the whole plan. Boarding started at 5:45. He was last in line. Not intentionally. He had been watching a ground crew member check the wheel assembly on a different aircraft across the tarmac and lost track of time. He walked down the jetway carrying the hard case and his duffel bag. He stepped through the cabin door, and the whole plane noticed him. Not loudly, not all at once. It was the kind of noticing that happens in parts. A woman in the 3rd row who had been looking at her phone glanced up and then looked back down too quickly. A man in a suit near the window seat shifted his laptop bag from one side to the other without any real reason to. A flight attendant near the galley, young, maybe her 2nd year, clocked him and then made herself look busy with the overhead bin latch she had already checked twice. Darnell noticed all of it. He always noticed. He had been noticing it since he was 19 years old and broad-shouldered and 6'2", and the world kept deciding what that meant before he opened his mouth. He found his seat. 5A. Window. He loaded his duffel into the overhead, put the hard case at his feet because he wasn't checking those parts under any circumstances, and sat down. The woman in 5B pressed herself slightly toward the aisle. Not dramatically. Just enough. Darnell looked out the window. A fuel truck was making its way along the tarmac. He watched it and thought about fuel injector seals and whether the foam he'd used was dense enough to protect the part during cargo handling, and whether the Fairbanks client was going to be difficult about the invoice. He did not think about the woman in 5B, or rather he thought about her, and then set the thought down somewhere he didn't have to look at it. He had a lot of practice at that. The plane filled up around him. Overhead bins slammed. People negotiated armrests with small passive gestures. A man 2 rows back talked too loud on his phone right up until a flight attendant asked him 3 times to please end his call before he actually ended it. Normal. All of it completely normal. And then the flight attendant from the galley came down the aisle doing pre-flight checks, and she stopped at row 5 and she looked at Darnell and she said, "Can I get you anything before we push back? Coffee, water, juice." Not the professional voice, the real one. He looked up. She was maybe 35, short natural hair pulled back, wearing the uniform like she'd been wearing it for years, which she had. Her name tag said Renee, and the way she was looking at him directly, without hesitation, without that microsecond of recalculation that people usually did, was different. "Just coffee," he said. "Black, thank you, you got it." She moved on. Darnell turned back to the window. Something in his shoulders had lowered without him deciding to lower them. He noticed that too. The seat in front of him was occupied by an older man who had settled in with the slow, deliberate movements of someone whose body negotiated with him now, rather than just following instructions. Late 70s, maybe older, wool jacket, a small pin on the lapel that most people in this cabin would not recognize and would not know to look for. Darnell recognized it. He knew exactly what it was. He had seen that pin in photographs first, then in a museum once on a trip he took by himself to the National Air and Space Museum when he was stationed in Virginia. And once, years ago, on a man at a Veterans Day event in Marietta, who had sat in the front row and shaken hands with everyone who came near him like handshakes were the currency he was trading in. Tuskegee Airman. The man in 4C was wearing the pin of the Tuskegee Airman on his lapel like it was just another piece of cloth. Darnell looked at it for a moment, then looked back out the window. The cabin door sealed. The jetway pulled away. The engines began their warm-up sequence and Darnell felt it in the floor before he heard it. The low vibration of turbines coming to life. The aircraft waking up around him. He closed his eyes for the taxi. Not to sleep, to listen. This was a thing he had always done. On every aircraft he had ever been in. He listened to the engines the way some people listened to music, tracking the pitch and the rhythm and the subtle variations that told you whether the machine was happy or working against itself. Most passengers heard engine noise and tuned it out. Darnell heard a language. Pushback, taxi. The turn onto the runway. Takeoff roll and the engines went to full power. And the world outside became a blur and the aircraft rotated and the ground dropped away and for a moment, like every time, there was that feeling. The brief, impossible feeling of the earth releasing its claim on you. He had never gotten used to it. He did not want to get used to it. 3 hours into the flight. Cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign had long since chimed off, and the cabin had settled into the particular quiet of people who have made their peace with being in the air. People opened laptops, pulled out headphones. The flight attendants began the service cart. He had not slept. He never slept on aircraft. There was too much to listen to. Darnell had his eyes half open, still listening. And then he heard it. Not loud, not alarming. Just a shift. A slight variation in the note of the right engine. A fractional change in the frequency of the vibration coming through the airframe on his side. You would have to know exactly what to listen for. You would have to have spent years with your hands inside these machines, and your ears tuned to every deviation from their baseline behavior. He knew what to listen for. He had spent years. He sat up slightly, kept his face neutral, reached into the front pocket of his duffel and found a pen. The only paper he had immediately available was a napkin from the galley that Renee had left with his coffee. He smoothed it out on his knee, wrote down what he'd heard. Time, duration, which engine, approximate frequency change, a quick note about what systems that pattern was consistent with, based on what he'd seen in the field. Looked at what he'd written. Looked out the window at the right engine nacelle, visible from where he sat. Everything looked normal from outside, which it usually did. He folded the napkin, put it in his shirt pocket. Then he sat back and told himself very clearly, this was not his aircraft, this was not his job, these were not his people. And there were professionals in the cockpit who had access to instrumentation that would catch anything that needed catching. He was a mechanic from Vine City on his way to deliver a part. That was all he was on this plane. He held that thought. He held it firmly, and then he heard the sound again. Slightly more pronounced this time. Still within the range of things that could be nothing. Still within the range of things that experienced crews caught and addressed all the time without any passenger ever knowing. Probably. He looked at the napkin in his shirt pocket. Looked away. The man in 4C shifted in his seat. Not to get comfortable. It was a different kind of shift. The kind of small adjustment that people make when something in their environment has changed, and they are processing whether it matters. Darnell watched him. The old man was still, eyes forward, but his head had tilted barely, just a degree toward the right side of the aircraft. He heard it too. Darnell felt something lock into place in his chest. Not panic. Something more focused than panic, something quieter and heavier. The man in 4C turned around, slowly. With some effort, the way turning around in an airline seat at 78 years old requires effort. He looked at Darnell. His eyes were dark brown and sharp in a way that age had not softened. Observing eyes. The kind you see in people who have spent a long time in situations where seeing clearly was the difference between going home and not going home. He looked at Darnell for a moment. Then he reached up and pulled back the left sleeve of his jacket. There it was, small. On the inside of his forearm, not a tattoo, an enamel pin he'd attached to a bracelet. The double wings, the red tail insignia. The Tuskegee Airman emblem, worn quietly and without announcement. The old man let Darnell see it. Then he said, low enough that only the two of them could hear, "You heard it." Not a question. Darnell said nothing. "Both times," the old man said. "I watched you." Darnell looked at him. Then at the engine, then back. "I'm a mechanic," he said. "I know what you are." The old man held his gaze. "My name is Ezra Beaumont. I flew B-52s for 31 years. I know what a flight engineer sounds like when he hears something that doesn't belong." A pause. "What did it sound like to you?" Darnell said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Fuel system. Possibly the crossfeed valve. Possibly early-stage contamination in the right tank feed line." He said it flat, like reading from a report. "Probably nothing. Could be caught on instruments before it develops into anything." Ezra Beaumont nodded slowly. "Probably," he said. The single word carried a weight that Darnell understood completely. Ezra turned back around. Darnell looked out the window at the right engine. He touched the napkin in his shirt pocket. Left it there. Renee came by with the service cart about 15 minutes later. She poured his coffee without being asked. Remembered he took it black and set it on his tray with a small bag of pretzels he hadn't ordered. He looked up. She said nothing. Just raised her eyebrows slightly, the universal shorthand for "you look like you could use this," and moved on to the next row. He ate the pretzels. He drank the coffee. He listened to the engine. 20 minutes of quiet. The aircraft held its altitude. The engine sound stayed within its shifted range but did not worsen. The cabin around him continued doing what cabins do. People watched movies. People slept with their mouths open. Someone 2 rows back was having a full conversation with themselves about whether they had packed the right charger. And then he noticed the man in the aisle seat across from him. Row 5. Seat C. He had noticed the man when he boarded. It would have been hard not to. Double-breasted suit in a shade of charcoal that cost more than Darnell's first month of rent on the Vine City space. Pocket square. Cufflinks. The particular posture of a man who had stopped being aware of how he took up space because no room had ever asked him to take up less. Raymond Goss. Darnell didn't know his name yet. Would learn it later. For now he was just the man in the suit who had, when Darnell walked down the aisle to seat 5A, made the very slight but very visible motion of pulling his laptop bag toward himself. Not a dramatic gesture, just enough. Goss was working on something that required a lot of scrolling through documents. He had the focused, efficient air of a man whose time is billed by the hour and who accounts for every one of those hours. Whatever he was going to Fairbanks for, it was important enough that he was reviewing documents at 35,000 feet at 7 in the morning. Darnell noted him and looked away. The engine made its sound again. This time it lasted a beat longer than the previous 2 instances. Darnell put down his coffee cup. He took out the napkin and added a note. Duration longer. Same frequency deviation. Consistent, with a progressive issue rather than transient variation. He put the napkin back in his pocket. Looked at the seat back in front of him. Thought, "You are a mechanic from Atlanta going to Fairbanks to deliver a fuel injector seal." Thought, There are trained professionals 40 feet ahead of you who have instruments you don't have. Thought, this is not your aircraft. Thought, sit down. Stay down. Mind your business. He was very good at minding his business. He had been minding his business for 38 years, and it had served him reasonably well. It had gotten him through the Air Force without anyone deciding he was too much. It had gotten him through 3 years of building a business that most people in his neighborhood had quietly assumed would fail. It had gotten him through 100 mornings of walking into rooms where everyone already had a picture of who he was before he said a word. Mind your business. Do your work. Don't ask anyone for anything they're not going to give freely. That was the operating principle. He held it. And then the aircraft did something subtle. The nose came up a quarter degree, maybe half. Not enough that passengers would notice. Not enough to show up dramatically on any instrument. But Darnell felt it in his body the way he always felt these things in the floor, in the armrest, in the faint shift of pressure in the cabin. And he felt the aircraft compensate and then compensate again, slightly overcorrecting. That was not the autopilot running smoothly. That was the autopilot working harder than it should be. He looked out the window. Right engine. Visual looked the same, which told him nothing, and he knew it. He looked at Ezra Beaumont's seat back. Ezra had not moved, but his right hand, resting on the armrest, had closed into a loose fist. Darnell unfolded the napkin a third time. Wrote AP compensation irregular. Possible asymmetric thrust issue developing. If crossfeed contamination is real, timeline compresses significantly once it reaches the primary feed line. He stared at what he'd written. 40 feet ahead of him, behind a reinforced door, a crew was flying this aircraft. They had instruments. They had checklists. They had training specifically designed for exactly this kind of situation. They had a captain. The whole system was built on the premise that the people in that cockpit knew what to do and had the tools to do it. He trusted the system. He had spent 10 years inside the system. The system was very good most of the time. Most of the time. He put the napkin in his shirt pocket for the 4th time and looked out the window and made himself stop writing things on napkins and stop listening to the engine and stop thinking about fuel crossfeed valves and autopilot compensation. He lasted about 4 minutes. Then the intercom chimed. The tone was different from the usual cabin announcement tone. Not dramatically different, but different enough that Renee, who was 3 rows back with the cart, stopped moving immediately. Darnell watched her. He watched her pick up the handset and listen, and he watched what happened to her face while she listened. Renee Caldwell had 11 years in the air. 11 years trained specifically to keep her face from showing passengers what she was thinking. She was very good at it. She put the handset down and she looked down the aisle, and her eyes found Darnell's for exactly 1 second. Then she looked away and set the cart brake and walked to the front of the cabin with a pace that was brisk without quite being urgent. Professional. Controlled. Darnell watched her go. He looked at the engine. He looked at the napkin in his shirt pocket. He looked at Ezra Beaumont's seat back. The old man's hand opened, then closed again. Renee was gone for 90 seconds. When she came back, she picked up the cabin intercom handset at the forward galley, and her voice came over the speaker, and it was even and professional and calibrated to project exactly the amount of calm that the situation required without revealing the dimensions of the situation. She said that there was a minor medical situation in the flight deck. She said that if there was a physician or medical professional on board, they should press their call button. She paused for one breath. Then she said that if there was anyone on board with aviation experience, commercial, military or technical, the flight crew would appreciate them identifying themselves to the nearest flight attendant. She set the handset down. The cabin went quiet in a way that was different from normal quiet. Darnell sat still. He did not press his call button. He did not raise his hand. He looked out the window at the right engine, and he listened to the sound it was making, and he thought about the napkin in his shirt pocket, and he thought about Vine City and his workbench and the loan payment and the Fairbanks client and the 3 years he had spent building something that finally looked like it might last. He thought about what it would mean to stand up in this cabin. He thought about what every person in this cabin would see when he stood up. He thought about the woman in 5B who had pressed herself toward the aisle. He thought about Goss in his suit pulling his laptop bag closer. He thought about the flight attendant who had checked the overhead bin latch twice. He thought, They will not see a flight engineer with 10 years of experience. He thought, they will see exactly what they already decided I was when I walked through that door. He sat, and then Ezra Beaumont turned around again. The old man moved with the same deliberate effort as before, turned in his seat until he was looking directly at Darnell, his dark eyes steady, that pin on his bracelet catching a fraction of light. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked. Then he said, "You wrote something down on that napkin 3 times. Darnell said nothing. "I'm 78 years old," Ezra said. "My eyes are still fine." A pause. "What did you write?" "Silence. Fuel system," Ezra said quietly. "That's what you told me. I told you it was probably nothing. You told me probably." The old man held his gaze. "That word is doing a lot of work right now, son." Darnell looked at the seat back in front of him. "I'm a mechanic," he said. "I don't fly these aircraft, I fix them." "You spent 10 years as a flight engineer." Darnell looked at him. "I told you," Ezra said simply. "I know what you are." The intercom chimed again. Renee's voice still controlled, this time asking specifically if anyone with aviation technical experience could please come to the front of the cabin. Not medical, aviation technical. The cabin stayed seated. Darnell listened to the engine. Ezra did not break eye contact with him. "There's a crew up front," Darnell said. "Trained crew. They have the instruments, they have the checklists. This is their aircraft, not mine," Ezra said. "You know what kind of experience the crew up front has?" Darnell said, "No, I don't. First officer is young. Very young. I heard how he spoke to the gate agent when we boarded. Newer pilot voice, newer pilot confidence." Ezra tilted his head slightly. "And whoever is flying this aircraft right now is fighting the autopilot. You felt that 3 minutes ago." Silence. "So did I," Ezra said. Darnell looked at the engine. The engine made its sound. He took the napkin out of his pocket, unfolded it. Read what he'd written one more time. All 4 entries. The progression of what he'd heard and felt, laid out in the shorthand he'd used for a decade in the Air Force. He folded it back up, looked at the front of the cabin where Renee had disappeared. He thought about every room he had ever walked into, every set of eyes that had recalibrated when they landed on him, every assumption that arrived before he did and stayed after he left. He thought about how this was different. This was. He stopped himself. This was not different. That was the thing. That was always the thing. You wanted it to be different. You wanted to say, this situation is different, these stakes are different. This one time it won't matter what they see when they look at me. And maybe it would matter. It probably would matter. It was almost certain to matter. He sat with that. Ezra Beaumont watched him sit with it. The old man said quietly, "In 1962, I landed a plane on a grass field in Georgia. In the dark, no instruments, no radio, by myself." A pause. "I was 26 years old, and I was the wrong color to be in that cockpit too." He held Darnell's gaze. "The people who needed me to land it didn't care about either of those things." The engine sound shifted again. Subtle, progressive, getting worse. Darnell stood up. Not because the feeling went away, not because the fear of how this cabin would look at him disappeared or became smaller, not because he stopped knowing exactly what he would see in Goss's face when he rose from his seat. He stood because the alternative, the specific alternative of sitting here, knowing what he knew, while this aircraft and the people in it continued forward, was a thing he found he could not make himself do. That was all. That was the whole reason. He stepped into the aisle, and Raymond Goss said it immediately, loud enough for the surrounding rows, the voice of a man accustomed to filling rooms with his certainty. "Sit down, you're a mechanic. Not a pilot." Darnell looked at him. Goss held his gaze with the steady confidence of someone who has never once in his life had his certainty challenged in a public space and found himself on the wrong side of it. The cabin watched. And then Colonel Ezra Beaumont, Tuskegee Airman, B-52 pilot, 31 years of service to the United States Air Force, rose slowly from seat 4C. He did not rise quickly. His knees did not cooperate with quickly. His back negotiated with him every step of the way, and he negotiated back, and the whole process of getting to his feet took longer than a younger man would have needed. But he got there, and he stood straight, the way men stand who have been told their whole lives to stand straight in rooms that did not want them there. He turned to face Goss, and he did not raise his voice. He did not need to raise his voice. There was something in the register of it, something practiced and absolute, The voice of a man who had given orders in conditions where the order needed to be heard and followed in the same second that made the cabin stop. He said, "I flew for the United States Air Force for 31 years. I know what a flight engineer looks like. I know what a man looks like when he has heard something in an aircraft that he cannot ignore." He looked at Goss. "That man has 10 years of technical experience on military aircraft systems. If you would like to argue his qualifications with me, I will be here when this is over. Right now he needs to get to the front of this aircraft." Silence. Complete and total silence. Goss said nothing. Nobody said anything. Darnell looked at Ezra for one moment. The old man gave him a single small nod. Darnell turned and walked toward the front of the cabin, and every eye in that aircraft watched him go. The woman in 5B, Goss with his laptop. The teenager 3 rows back who had been pretending to sleep. The businessman who had checked his watch 4 times since the intercom announcement. All of them watched, and not one of them said another word. Renee met him at the galley curtain. She was holding it open. She looked at him and said, "What do you know?" Just that. Direct. No preamble. And he said, "Right engine fuel feed. Possible contamination through an open crossfeed valve. It's been building for about 30 minutes. He met her eyes. "I need to see the cockpit." She studied him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she held the curtain open wider. "Come with me," she said. She led him to the cockpit door, and she knocked the crew knock, and the door opened, and the first thing Darnell saw was Jerome Ossie, 29 years old, both hands on the controls, sweat at his temple. Eyes working the instruments with the rapid focus of someone who has moved beyond nervous into the territory on the other side of nervous. And in the captain's seat, her head tilted slightly to the left, her hands not on the controls, Adrienne Fouché. He had heard about Captain Fouché. He had not seen her before today. He had not seen her walk through the terminal this morning, had not seen her at the gate, had not seen her before he boarded. Renee had said nothing about her except the one word captain when he asked whose aircraft this was. But even now, even like this, slumped slightly in the left seat, face slack in a way that did not belong on a face like that, there was something in her that the cockpit light caught. She was young. Younger than he'd expected from a captain. 34, he'd learn later. Her uniform was pressed with the care of someone who understood that appearance was part of the job, that being taken seriously required not giving anyone a reason not to. Her hair was pulled back precisely. Even now, even unconscious, the structure of her face was striking. A word he did not reach for easily, just true. Dr. Simone Parrish was already in the cockpit, kneeling beside the captain's seat, 2 fingers at Adrian's throat, expression focused and neutral the way physicians go neutral when they are thinking fast and need the thinking undisturbed. Jerome looked up at Darnell. His eyes traveled from Darnell's face to his workwear to his hands still with the faint remnants of grease at the knuckles and back to his face. "Who are you?" Jerome said. "My name is Darnell Booker. I spent 10 years as a flight engineer in the Air Force, and I've been working on commercial aircraft systems for 3 years. Your right engine has been showing a frequency deviation for the past 30 minutes consistent with a fuel contamination issue." He stepped closer and looked at the instrument panel. "Is your fuel cross-feed valve open?" Jerome's expression shifted. "We opened it 40 minutes ago," he said. Fuel levels were running uneven. Captain Fouché initiated the balance. Darnell looked at the panel. "Right there. The cross-feed valve indicator. Open." "She didn't close it," Darnell said. We got the levels balanced and then..." Jerome stopped. "She didn't close it. Which means both engines have been feeding from the same tank. Which means if there's contamination in that tank, both engines are drinking it." Darnell was already scanning the other indicators. Oil pressure on number 2. Temperature on number 2. The autopilot compensation reading. All of it lining up in a picture he had hoped would not be this clear when he got up here. It was very clear. "Close the crossfeed valve," Darnell said. "Right now." Jerome said, I don't have the authority to..." "Close the crossfeed valve," Darnell said again. Not loud, not angry. Just exact. You have 90 seconds before the contaminated fuel in the primary feed line reaches the intake on engine 1. I've seen this exact failure pattern. Close the valve. Jerome looked at him. Jerome looked at Dr. Parrish. Dr. Parrish said, without looking up from Adrian, he told me what he heard from 30 rows back. He was right about all of it. She pressed 2 fingers to Adrian's wrist. Close the valve, Jerome. Jerome closed the valve. The engine sound changed. Not dramatically. Subtly, the way a house sounds different when you fix the thing that's been wrong with it. Settling into something closer to normal. Not all the way there, but closer. Darnell let out a breath he had been holding since seat 5A. He looked at the right engine instruments. He looked at engine 1. He looked at the maintenance log on the side panel, the binder that every aircraft carried, recording every inspection and flagged issue, and cleared discrepancy for this aircraft's full history. He reached for it. Jerome said, "What are you looking for?" Darnell found the most recent entries and started reading. And 3 lines from the top, in the record from this aircraft's previous flight, he found it. Fuel feed line pressure variation noted. Right tank. Monitoring. Someone had seen this before. Someone had flagged it. And below that, in different handwriting, 1 line. Reviewed. No action required. Darnell read it twice. He looked at the signature at the bottom of the notation. He read that twice too. He knew that name. He had seen that name on paperwork before. He set the binder down. Outside the cockpit windows, 35,000 feet below, America moved past in silence. Green and brown, and the silver threads of rivers, and the gray patches of cities, and the whole enormous ordinary country going about its business with no idea that above it, a mechanic from Vine City was standing in a cockpit with grease on his knuckles and a napkin in his shirt pocket, looking at a maintenance log entry that told him this was not an accident. Jerome said, "What did you find?" Darnell looked at the engine instruments. Number 1 was holding, for now. He looked at the maintenance log, at the signature, at the words "no action required." He picked up the binder again and looked at the date. 6 weeks ago. He had been in this aircraft's maintenance chain 6 weeks ago. Not this aircraft. A different one. Same operator. Same type. Same reported issue. He had flagged the same problem and been told by the same name, the same signature at the bottom of the same kind of notation that it had been reviewed and no action was required. He had thought about pushing back. He had not pushed back. Because it was not his aircraft and he was a subcontract mechanic. And the signature on that form belonged to a man who had been in this industry longer than Darnell had been alive. He had let it go. He had let it go because that was the operating principle. Mind your business. Do your work. Don't ask anyone for anything they're not going to give freely. He stood in the cockpit of an aircraft that had been flying on a known fault for 6 weeks. He looked at the engine instruments. Engine 1 was still holding. Darnell set the binder down, closed it, and turned to the instrument panel. "Okay," he said. Jerome looked at him. "Tell me where we are," Darnell said. "And tell me where the nearest field is with a long runway and emergency equipment standing by." He looked at Jerome. "We're going to need both." Jerome Ossie had 2,847 flight hours. He knew that number exactly. The way young pilots know their hours exactly, the way people count things that define them. 2,847 hours in the air. Enough to earn his seat. Enough to pass every check ride, every simulator session, every evaluation thrown at him since he graduated from Embry-Riddle with a degree and a certainty that the cockpit was where he belonged. Not enough for this. Not even close to enough for this. He had been alone up here for 11 minutes before Darnell walked through that door. 11 minutes of Captain Fouché unconscious in the left seat and Dr. Parrish working on her, and the instruments telling Jerome things he did not want to hear, and his hands on the controls doing the job they were trained to do while the rest of him was somewhere between functional and falling apart. He had held the aircraft. That was what he kept telling himself. Whatever else was happening. He had held the aircraft. Now there was a man in workwear standing at his shoulder, reading the maintenance log with grease on his knuckles, and the expression of someone who has just found something they were afraid they would find. Jerome said, "What did you find?" Darnell closed the binder, set it on the side panel, looked at the instruments for 3 full seconds without speaking. Then he said, "Where are we and where's the nearest suitable field?" Jerome pulled up the nav display. "We're over central Montana. Fairbanks is still our destination 4 hours out. But there's a regional field at," he checked the display. "Billings. About 40 miles southeast. Long runway, they'll have equipment. How's our fuel state?" "We tanked heavy out of Atlanta. We have fuel." "Engine 1 pressure?" Jerome checked. "Holding." Stable. Darn looked at the right engine instruments. Number 2. The valve was closed. The contaminated feed was isolated. But whatever had already moved through the lines before Jerome closed it, that was still there. Still in the system. still working its way through. The crossfeed was open for how long? Darnell said. 40, maybe 45 minutes. Darnell did not respond to that immediately. Jerome knew what that meant. He had done the math already, and he did not like the math, and the fact that Darnell was doing his own version of the same math in silence was not making the math feel any better. Billings, Darnell said. Billings, get me a frequency, declare. Not Pan Mayday. He looked at Jerome. Get every truck they have rolling before we're 10 miles out. Jerome reached for the radio. And that was the moment, that specific moment, with Darnell's hand on the instrument panel and Jerome's hand on the radio and Dr. Parrish still working in the left seat and the cockpit door, sealed against whatever was happening in the cabin behind it. That was the moment Jerome Ossie understood that he was not going to be the one who got these people home. And that understanding did something unexpected to him. It made him stop shaking. Because there is a particular kind of terror that comes from being alone with a responsibility you cannot carry. And there is a different thing, not comfort, not safety, not the absence of fear, but a different thing that arrives when someone steps into the room who can carry it with you. Jerome keyed the radio. He declared, loud and clear, the way they trained you to say it, the word that pilots spend their whole careers hoping never to need. Mayday. In the cabin, Renee Caldwell heard the intercom go quiet and understood that something had changed. She had been doing what she always did in difficult situations, which was move. Not fast enough to alarm anyone. Not slow enough to be ineffective. The particular calibrated pace of 11 years of learning how to be the calmest person in a panicking room. She had walked the aisle twice since the announcement, checked on every row, spoken quietly to the passengers who were visibly frightened, and said nothing to the ones who were pretending not to be, because sometimes the pretending was holding them together, and the worst thing you could do was interrupt it. The cabin was not calm. It was performing calm, which is different. People were on their phones. Not calling anyone, there was no signal at altitude but holding them, looking at photos. Doing the small private things people do when they need to remind themselves what they're going home to. The woman in 5B had her hands folded in her lap, looking at the seat back in front of her. She had not moved since Darnell walked past her to the front of the plane. Renee noticed that. She noticed most things. Raymond Goss, across the aisle, had closed his laptop. That alone was telling. A man like Goss did not close his laptop unless the situation had his full attention. He was sitting with his hands still on the keyboard, not working, just sitting, looking at the seat back the same way the woman in 5B was looking at hers. Renee stopped beside him. She said quietly, "Sir, is there anything I can get you?" Goss looked up at her, and what she saw in his face was not what she expected from a man who had told another passenger to sit down 20 minutes ago, with the confidence of someone who had never once in his life been told he was wrong in public. He looked smaller, not afraid, not remorseful, just smaller, like a man who has been given information his certainty wasn't built to process. He said, "Is it bad?" Renee said, "We have someone qualified working with the first officer. The situation is being managed." Goss said, the mechanic. "Yes, a pause." Goss looked at his hands on the closed laptop. "I've been flying for 20 years, he said. I know what a Mayday declaration sounds like over a radio, even muffled through a cockpit door." Renee held his gaze. She said, "The situation is being managed." She moved on. Behind her, in row 4, Ezra Beaumont had his eyes closed, not sleeping. Renee could tell the difference. His hands were open on his armrests. His chin was level. He looked like a man conserving something, energy, focus, whatever internal resource allows a person to be 78 years old and unafraid. She stopped beside him. He opened his eyes. She said, "He made it up there." Ezra said, "I know." He closed the valve. Ezra said, "Good then, how's the engine?" Renee blinked. "I'm sorry, engine 1, is it holding?" She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "I don't know." "Go find out," Ezra said. "And when you talk to him next, tell him I said don't rush the descent. Slow and clean, he'll know what that means." She didn't ask him to explain it. She went to find out. In the cockpit, engine 1 was not holding the way it had been. Not failing, not shutting down, not dramatic, just not quite right. Darnell had been watching the oil pressure indicator on number 1 for 6 minutes, and it had dropped 4 points in those 6 minutes, and while 4 points was not a crisis, it was a direction, and directions mattered more than numbers in situations like this. He said, "It's getting into engine 1. Jerome said, "How?" "Residual. Whatever was in the lines before you closed the valve, it's still working through the system. The valve being closed stops the fresh contamination. It doesn't clean what's already moving. He kept his eyes on the pressure indicator. It may stabilize, or it may continue dropping. Jerome said, and if it continues dropping, Darnell said, then we have a different conversation. Jerome processed that. Then, what do we do? Nothing yet. We watch it. Darnell looked at the airspeed, at the altimeter, at the nav display showing Billings 40 miles out and closing. How long to Billings at current speed? 18 minutes. Hold what we have, don't descend yet. Give the engine the cleaner air up here while we still have time. He looked at Jerome. Slow and clean, you understand? Jerome said, slow and clean. If the pressure drops below, Darnell named a number. You tell me immediately. Copy. Renee came back through the cockpit door. She stood in the small space between the seats and the door, and she looked at Darnell and she said, the old man in 4C says don't rush the descent. Slow and clean. Darnell looked at her. Something moved in his jaw. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to one. Tell him I heard him, Darnell said. Renee nodded and looked at the instrument panel with the focused attention of someone who has learned over 11 years what to watch for. Engine 1? Watching it. Captain? Dr. Parrish answered without looking up. She had Adrian's wrist in her hand and her other hand at Adrian's shoulder, and her expression had not changed in 40 minutes. Focused. Neutral. Processing. She's stable. Pulse is regular. She's not in immediate danger. A pause. She needs a hospital within 3 hours. We'll be on the ground in 20, Darnell said. Simone looked up at that. At Darnell. At the instruments back at Darnell. You're sure, she said. Not a challenge. A physician asking for the actual assessment. Not entirely, Darnell said, but that's what we're working toward. Simone nodded. Went back to Adrian. Honest. She could work with honest. The next 9 minutes were the quietest 9 minutes of the flight. Quiet in the specific way that emergencies sometimes go quiet, not because the danger has passed, but because everyone has located their job and is doing it, and the doing takes all the sound out of the room. Jerome flew. Darnell watched the instruments. Simone monitored Adrian. Renee held the cockpit door closed with her presence on the other side of it, moving through the cabin with the unhurried steadiness that was keeping 200 people from knowing exactly how serious this was. 6 minutes out from Billings. The oil pressure on engine 1 dropped 3 more points. Jerome said, it's dropping. I see it. It's past the threshold you named. I see it. Darnell put his hand near the engine controls. Not on them. Near them. It's not seizing. The temperature isn't climbing. It's losing pressure, but it's not. He watched the indicator. It's slowing. Jerome watched it too. The needle moved again, then stopped. Both of them looked at it. It stopped, Jerome said. Don't celebrate, Darnell said. It stopped moving for now. That's different from stable. He kept his hand near the controls. We're still landing at Billings. We are not continuing to Fairbanks. This aircraft is going to a maintenance facility the moment we're on the ground. Jerome said agreed. A pause. Jerome said, can I ask you something? Darnell said, you can ask me anything except to take my eyes off this panel. Why did you stand up? The question landed in the cockpit and sat there. Darnell kept his eyes on the instruments. He said, the engine was making a sound I recognized. That's not. Jerome stopped. Started again. Half the plane was watching when you stood up. That man in the suit told you to sit down. You knew how it was going to look. Darnell said nothing. Why? Jerome said again. Darnell looked at the oil pressure indicator. Steady. Not stable, steady for now. Which was different, but it was what they had. He said, because I knew what the sound meant. And nobody else on this aircraft did. And if I sat there knowing what I knew, he stopped. He said, I couldn't sit there knowing what I knew. Jerome took that in. Said, that's it, that's it. Jerome looked at the nav display. Billings was 10 miles out. The regional field coming up on the display as a set of coordinates and a runway designation and a frequency that someone on the ground was already monitoring, because Jerome had declared 20 minutes ago and the trucks were rolling. Jerome said, I'm glad you didn't sit there. Darnell said, don't thank me yet. We still have to land this thing. In the cabin, the mood had shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way that you could point to and name. But Renee could feel it the way she always felt these things, in the quality of the silence, in the angle of people's shoulders, in the way eyes moved when she passed. People knew something was wrong. They had known since the Mayday. Even muffled through the cockpit door, Raymond Goss was not the only person on this aircraft who recognized what that word meant over a radio. Renee walked the aisle. She stopped at every row that needed stopping at. She said the same thing she had been saying. The situation was being managed. Qualified personnel were working with the first officer. They would have more information shortly. Please remain seated and keep seatbelts fastened. She said it with the particular conviction of someone who actually believes it. Because she did. She had looked at Darnell Booker when he stepped into that cockpit. She had watched him look at that instrument panel. She had watched him close the valve and pick up the maintenance log and put his hand near the engine controls with the unhurried authority of someone who has done this kind of work in his sleep. She believed him. 11 years in the air had taught her many things. One of them was this: scared men announce themselves. They come in loud, they demand. They perform competence like a man trying on a suit that doesn't quite fit. Darnell Booker had walked into that cockpit and looked at the instruments like they were already his to read. She believed him. She stopped at row 4. Ezra had his eyes open now, looking at the seat back in front of him with the unhurried attention of a man reviewing something he has already thought through thoroughly. Renee said, "He heard you." Ezra said, "Good. Do you want to know what's happening?" "I know what's happening." She looked at him. "How?" Ezra said, "I've been flying for 50 years, young lady. I know what an aircraft sounds like when it's having trouble. I know what a crew sounds like when they're working a real emergency." He looked at her directly. "And I know what a man looks like when he's carrying knowledge he didn't plan to need today." Renee said, "He's good." Ezra said, "He's better than good." A pause. "He's the kind of good that doesn't know it's good yet. The kind that spent so much time being told what it is that it forgot to notice what it can do." Renee looked at him. Ezra said, "Tell him that too when this is over." She almost smiled. "I'll tell him," she said. She moved on. The woman in 5B caught Renee's sleeve as she passed. Not urgently. Just a hand on her arm. Renee stopped. The woman was maybe 60. Silver-streaked hair, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, the look of someone who had been holding a specific feeling for a while, and wasn't sure what to do with it now. She said, "The man who went up front." Renee waited. "I moved my bag," the woman said. "When he sat down next to me, I moved it to my lap." She said it plainly, without decoration. "I want you to know that I did that." Renee looked at her. The woman said, "Is he going to be able to?" "Yes," Renee said. She said it before the sentence finished, firmly. "Yes." The woman nodded, looked back at the seat back in front of her, held whatever she was holding. Renee moved on, 5 miles out. In the cockpit, Darnell had begun the pre-landing sequence with Jerome beside him, calling out the checklist items in the clear practiced rhythm of a pilot doing exactly what training intended. Each item answered, each confirmation given. The two of them finding a rhythm that neither of them had planned for, and both of them needed. Gear, flaps, speed checks, Billings Tower. This is Jerome gave the flight number. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Engine anomaly, single engine approach, captain incapacitated, medical emergency on board. Requesting immediate priority. Souls on board 212. The tower responded instantly. Clean and fast, and with the particular quality of a controller who has handled emergencies before and is not going to make this one harder. Runway cleared, equipment standing by, wind direction and speed given twice. Priority approach confirmed. Jerome looked at Darn 1, pressure holding, still not stable, still not trustworthy, but holding. 3 miles, Jerome said. Talk to me about the crosswind. 180 at 12, variable. Variable how? Gusting to 17, shifting left. Darnell thought about that. A shifting crosswind on a single engine approach with an instrument panel he had been reading for 25 minutes, instead of 25 years, on a type he had maintained but never flown. He thought about that, and then he set it aside, because thinking about it was not going to change it, and what it required was not thought. What it required was the same thing the last 40 minutes had required, which was to look at what was in front of him and do the next thing. "I need you to call every number," he said to Jerome. "Every airspeed change, every altitude, every wind shift. You don't wait for me to ask. You see it, you say it." Jerome said, "Copy. If engine 1 does anything at all, you say it in the same breath. Copy, and if I'm wrong about something." Jerome said, "You haven't been wrong yet." Darnell said, "I've been lucky yet. There's a difference." He looked at Jerome. "If I'm wrong about something, tell me," Jerome said. "I'll tell you." "Good." Darnell looked at the approach 2 miles. The runway visible on the nav display. The real one concrete and lights and emergency vehicles already lining the grass on both sides, still invisible behind the gray layer of low cloud sitting at 4,000 feet, 2 miles and descending. Behind them, through the sealed door, the cabin had gone completely still. Not the performing calm still. Something different. The particular silence of 200 people who have stopped pretending and are sitting with whatever they actually believe about the next few minutes. Renee was at the forward galley. She had done everything she could do in the cabin. She had braced what needed bracing and checked what needed checking and said what needed saying. She had walked that aisle 4 times and spoken to every person who needed speaking to and said nothing to the ones who needed the silence. Now she stood at the galley and held the counter and breathed. And she thought about something Ezra Beaumont had said. The kind of good that doesn't know it's good yet. She thought about Darnell walking onto this plane with his hard case and his grease-marked hands. She thought about the woman in 5B pulling her bag into her lap. She thought about Goss telling a man to sit down. She thought about what it cost to stand up anyway. 1 mile. 1,500 feet, Drum called. Speed good. On glide path. Darnell made a small adjustment, felt the aircraft respond. Noted the quality of the response, slightly sluggish on the right side, the asymmetric effect of the dead engine. Something he compensated for with left rudder, before Jerome even finished calling the airspeed. 1,200 feet, the cloud layer. They entered it, and the world outside the windscreen went gray and flat and formless. The runway approach lights still invisible, nothing to see except the instruments and the instruments showing them exactly where they needed to be. 800 feet on centerline, speed stable, engine 1 held 600 feet. Darnell kept his eyes on the attitude indicator. Altimeter. Airspeed. The rhythm of the scan he'd learned watching pilots run these approaches for 10 years from the jump seat. The same rhythm now in his hands, in his eye. Translated from observation into action in a way that should not have been as natural as it was. 400 feet. Still no visual on the runway. 300 feet. Wind shifting, gusting now, correction. 280 at 15. Darnell adjusted rudder. Felt the aircraft try to drift right. Corrected. 200 feet gray. Everything gray outside the glass. 100 feet, still on centerline, speed. And then the cloud broke. Not gradually. Instantly, the gray tore open like a curtain. And there was the runway right there. Exactly where Jerome's numbers had said it would be. Concrete and lights and the white centerline stripe stretching ahead and the red and blue and white of emergency vehicles on the grass on both sides and the whole impossible ordinary reality of solid ground. Runway in sight, Jerome said. His voice broke on the last word. Just slightly, I have it, Darnell said. He made 3 adjustments in the final 20 feet, rudder, aileron, throttle. Each one small, each one precise. The aircraft settling into the landing attitude with the patient, unhurried authority of something that has finally found where it belongs. The wheels touched. Not slammed, not dragged. Touched. Like a question answered carefully. The cabin behind the door made a sound. Darnell heard it even through the sealed door, even over the engine noise and the tire squeal and the reverse thrust kicking in. A collective exhale. A sound that 200 people make together when they have been holding their breath for 40 minutes and the ground has finally arrived. He kept both hands on the controls. Braking, he said. Braking, Jerome confirmed. Centerline good. You're tracking. The aircraft decelerated. Emergency vehicles began moving on the grass alongside, matching their speed. Ready. Slower. Slower. Stop. The aircraft came to a complete stop in the middle of the runway, with emergency equipment surrounding them on 3 sides, and the sound of the single remaining engine winding down and the cockpit going quiet in a way it had not been quiet since Darnell walked through that door. Jerome put his face in his hands. He stayed that way for 10 seconds. Then he lowered his hands and his eyes were red, and he looked at the instruments. And he looked at Darnell and he said, "You did it." Darnell said, "We did it." Jerome said, "I called numbers. Those numbers mattered." Jerome shook his head, not disagreeing, just overwhelmed in the specific way of someone who has experienced something too large for the immediate processing of it. Dr. Parrish was already on the intercom calling for the emergency crew. Adrian Fouché was being prepared for transfer. The cockpit door opened and Renee was there, and her face was the face of someone who has been holding 11 years of professionalism together by force of will, and is now in the privacy of this small doorway, allowing herself to feel whatever she actually feels. Darnell looked at her. She said, "You brought us home," he said. "Is everybody okay?" She said, "Everybody's okay." He nodded once, looked at the stopped aircraft around him, at the emergency lights outside the cockpit glass, at the runway stretching out ahead to where the concrete ended and Montana began. He said, "Good." And that was all he said. Because the door was opening, and the emergency crews were boarding, and the cockpit was suddenly full of people with equipment and purpose, and the organized, efficient motion of a ground response that had been ready and waiting and needed this moment to arrive. And Darnell stepped back against the side panel to let them through. He let them work. He was good at letting people work. When they brought the gurney for Adrian, Darnell was standing just inside the cockpit door. They moved her carefully, Simone alongside them, talking, handing off her notes, the physician's handoff that translated 40 minutes of monitoring into the language of the people who would take over from here. As they lifted the gurney, Adrian's eyes opened. Not fully, not with clarity, but enough. Her eyes found the cockpit, found the instruments, found the stopped world outside the glass, and then they found Darnell. He was in her peripheral vision, a man in workwear with grease on his hands standing against the panel of her aircraft. Not where he was supposed to be, not where anyone like him was supposed to be. Her eyes stayed on him for 3 seconds. He could not tell what she saw. She was taken out through the door. Jerome watched her go. Then he looked at Darnell and he said, "She's going to want to know who you are." Darnell said, "She can ask me later." Jerome said, "She will, the cabin." Renee went through the cockpit door and down the aisle, and she picked up the intercom handset, and she said, and this time her voice did break, just once, just at the start of the sentence. And then it held. She said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are on the ground at Billings. Everyone is safe." And the cabin erupted. Not applause exactly. Not cheering exactly. Something older than either of those things. 200 people making the sound of people who have come back from somewhere and know it. In row 4, Ezra Beaumont sat with his eyes closed and his hands open on the armrests. He did not make any sound. He did not need to. He was a man who had spent 50 years knowing that the person who brings the aircraft home rarely looks the way people expect, rarely sounds the way people expect, rarely comes from the place people expect. He had spent 50 years knowing that, and he had watched it be true again today, in the seat behind him, in the form of a man with grease on his hands and a napkin full of calculations in his shirt pocket, who had heard something no one else heard, and had stood up in a cabin full of people who told him to sit down. Ezra Beaumont opened his eyes. The cabin was alive with sound around him. People talking, people crying quietly, a woman somewhere behind him repeating the same word over and over in a low voice, like a prayer that had finally been answered. Ezra sat with it, and outside on the runway in Billings, Montana, the emergency vehicles arranged themselves around a stopped aircraft like a kind of honor guard, their lights still turning, and the ground crew moved with purpose, and the sky above was the same unremarkable American gray it had been all morning. Ordinary. Everything ordinary again. Except that somewhere between Atlanta and the ground, something had shifted. And the woman in 5B, who was still sitting in her seat with her hands in her lap, not moving, working through something she did not yet have words for. In Raymond Goss, who had opened his laptop again, and then closed it again, and was sitting with his hands folded on top of it, staring at the seat back in front of him with an expression he would not have recognized on his own face. In Jerome Ossie, who was sitting in the right seat of the cockpit he had been flying alone 11 minutes ago, looking at the stopped instruments, understanding something about himself that 2,847 hours had not yet taught him. And in the maintenance log, still sitting on the side panel where Darnell had set it down, closed, but not finished, not even close to finished. The emergency crews worked fast. That was the first thing Darnell noticed when he stepped off the aircraft. How fast everything moved on the ground. How organized. How the trucks had positioned themselves and the personnel had distributed themselves. And the whole response had the quality of a system that had rehearsed for exactly this and was now running the real version without hesitation. He stood on the tarmac in the cold Montana air and watched them work. His hard case was still on the aircraft. His duffel bag, too. He had walked off with nothing except the napkin in his shirt pocket and the maintenance log tucked under his arm because he had picked it up at the last moment and carried it out without deciding to, and now he was standing on the tarmac holding it. He looked at it, looked at the runway, looked at the aircraft sitting still at the end of it, with the emergency lights still turning around it, and the ground crews moving in and out through the forward door. He had done that. He had brought that aircraft down, not alone. Jerome had flown the radios, the checklists, every number of the approach. Dr. Parrish had kept Adrian alive through 40 minutes of a cockpit working against itself. Renee had held 200 people, together with nothing but her voice and her presence, and 11 years of understanding what people need when they are scared. Not alone. But he had done it. He stood with that for a moment. Not pride exactly. Something quieter than pride. Something that did not have a good name yet. A ground crew member in an orange vest approached him. Young. Maybe 25. He looked at Darnell's workwear and the maintenance log under his arm and he said, "Sir, are you with the airline?" Darnell said no. The young man said, "Were you a passenger?" Darnell said yes. The young man looked at the maintenance log. Darnell said, "I need to talk to whoever from the FAA is responding to this." The young man said, "There's an investigator on the way. She should be here," and he checked his radio. 20 minutes. Darnell said, "I'll wait." He walked to the edge of the tarmac, found a concrete barrier that was the right height to sit on, sat down, put the maintenance log on his knee. The Montana sky was the color of old dishwater, low and flat and gray in every direction, cold enough that his breath showed. He had not worn a jacket because Atlanta had been 62 degrees when he left, and he had not thought about Montana at 7 in the morning, and he was now paying for that specific failure of planning. He did not move. He sat with the maintenance log on his knee and the cold coming through his workwear, and he thought about the signature at the bottom of that notation. No action required. He knew that name. Walter Briggs, Senior Maintenance Supervisor at the largest contract maintenance operations serving this airline's Atlanta hub. 26 years in commercial aviation maintenance. The kind of man whose name appeared on certifications and approvals and sign-offs up and down the chain of accountability. The kind of name that made investigators uncomfortable. Because investigators who made a man like Walter Briggs uncomfortable found that their next investigation was harder to open than the last one. Darnell knew this because he had tried to push back on a Walter Briggs sign-off 6 weeks ago. A different aircraft, same fuel feed issue. Flagged by Darnell during a subcontract inspection. Reviewed by Briggs. Cleared by Briggs. And Darnell had looked at that clearance and known it was wrong, and spent 2 days thinking about whether to file a formal challenge. He had not filed the challenge, because he was a subcontract mechanic with a 3-bay operation in Vine City and Briggs was Briggs, and the operating principle was mind your business. He looked at the maintenance log on his knee. Mind your business, he had done that, and 200 people had almost died for it. Behind him, the passengers were being brought off the aircraft and directed to a temporary staging area near the terminal building. Ground and crew members were escorting them in small groups. He could hear the ambient sound of people on the move bags rolling on concrete, voices low and slightly shell-shocked, the particular shuffle of a group of people who have been through something and have not yet decided what to make of it. He did not turn around. He sat with the maintenance log and the cold and the thing he should have done 6 weeks ago. Jerome came out 20 minutes later. He came across the tarmac with his uniform jacket still buttoned, his captain's wings catching what little light the gray sky offered. He looked like a man who has just landed a plane he was not sure he could land, which is exactly what he was. He walked, with the slight careful movement of someone whose body is still coming down from something. He sat on the barrier next to Darnell. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Jerome said, "She's at the hospital. They took her straight from the aircraft." A pause. Dr. Parrish went with her. Darnell said, "Good. Taya, they're saying. Transient ischemic attack." She was conscious in the ambulance, responding. Jerome looked at his hands. She asked about the aircraft. Darnell said, "That sounds right. They told her it was on the ground. Everyone's safe." Jerome looked at the stopped aircraft at the end of the runway. They did not tell her who landed it. A pause. Darnell said, "Probably for the best." Jerome, "She's going to find out. She can find out later." Jerome looked at him. "What are you going to do with that?" He nodded at the maintenance log. Darnell looked at it. "Give it to the FAA investigator, and then? That's her job, not mine." Jerome said, that signature is going to cause problems for someone. Yes. For Briggs. Yes. He has a lot of relationships in this industry. Darnell said, I know. And you're a subcontract mechanic with a... I know, Darnell said. Quiet. Jerome said, I'll testify, whatever you need, whatever the investigation requires, I'll put my name on it. Darnell looked at him. Jerome said, I was in that cockpit. I saw what you saw, I read that log. He held Darnell's gaze. Whatever it costs, I'll put my name on it. Darnell said, you understand what that means for your career. Jerome said, I understand what it means if I don't. Darnell looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the maintenance log. He said, it means the same thing it meant for me when I stood up in that cabin. Jerome said, yeah, did it feel the same? Jerome thought about it. It feels bigger, he said. Standing up in the cabin, that was immediate. There was no time to think about it. He stopped. This is choosing to do it when I have time to think about it. Darnell said, that's harder. Yeah. Do it anyway. Jerome said, yeah. They sat on the barrier in the Montana cold, and the ground crews moved around them, and the emergency lights on the surrounding vehicles began, one by one, to switch off. Renee found them there 15 minutes later. She came across the tarmac still in her uniform, her composure fully restored now, the professional surface back in place with only the slight redness around her eyes giving away what the last hour had cost her. She stopped in front of them both and looked at Darnell with the directness that had been there from the moment she handed him a cup of black coffee in seat 5A. She said, the old man wants to see you. Darnell said, Colonel Beaumont? He's in the terminal. He asked me to find you. She paused. He was very specific about the word find. Like I might need directions. Darnell almost smiled. He stood up, picked up the maintenance log, looked at Jerome. Jerome said, go. I'll stay with the aircraft until the FAA gets here. Darnell nodded. He followed Renee across the tarmac. The terminal at Billings was small. Regional airport small. With the particular character of airports that serve mostly practical travelers, people going somewhere because they need to go somewhere, not because the destination is glamorous. Fluorescent lighting, plastic chairs bolted to the floor in rows, a single coffee kiosk just inside the security door that was doing significant business. The passengers from the flight had been directed to a holding area near the gate. Most of them were sitting. Some were standing near the windows looking out at the aircraft. Some were on phones. The ambient energy was the energy of a group that has survived something and is still processing whether it's real. Darnell walked through the door and the room noticed him. Not the way rooms had been noticing him for 38 years. Different. The same eyes. The same turning of heads. The same awareness spreading in a wave from the door inward as he crossed the threshold. But different. Because this time the woman in 5B who had pressed herself toward the aisle when he sat down, who had held her bag in her lap like a shield for 4 hours, looked up when he walked in, and what she did was stand. Not dramatically. Not with any announcement, she just stood up, like she needed to be on her feet when he walked past. Like sitting was the wrong posture for this moment. Darnell walked past her. She said nothing. He said nothing, but he saw it. He saw it and said it in the same place he said everything, the place that was not forgetting, that was not forgiving. That was just the careful ongoing process of being a man who notices everything and carries it without letting it carry him. Ezra Beaumont was sitting in the far corner of the holding area, away from the main cluster of passengers, in one of the plastic chairs, with his hands folded on his knee and his wool jacket still buttoned and his Tuskegee pin catching the fluorescent light. He looked like he had been waiting. Not impatiently, in the way of a man who has done a great deal of waiting in his life and has made peace with it. Darnell sat down in the chair next to him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Ezra said, "How are you?" Darnell said, "I don't know yet." Ezra nodded. "That's the right answer." A pause. Darnell said, "You flew B-52s. You told me about the grass field in Georgia. 1962. I did. That wasn't just a story." Ezra said, "No, it wasn't." Darnell looked at the maintenance log on his knee. "You knew when you turned around and looked at me. You knew I wasn't going to stand up on my own." Ezra said, "I knew you needed to hear it said out loud. That you were a pilot. That what you were doing was what a pilot does." A pause. "You had been told for long enough that you weren't. I'm not a pilot. I've never flown." "You landed that aircraft," Ezra said. "I'll let you decide what that makes you." Darnell said nothing. Ezra looked at the maintenance log. "That's the log." "Yes." What are you going to do with it? Give it to the investigator, Ezra said. And the name on it? Darnell said. That's for the investigation to handle, will they? Darnell looked at him. Ezra said, I've been in this country a long time. I've watched a lot of systems handle a lot of things. Some they handle well. He paused. Some they handle in a way that makes the problem go away without making the problem go away. Darnell said, I know. And the aircraft that had the same issue 6 weeks ago is still flying. He looked at the log. Until someone puts a name on what happened and why it'll keep flying. Ezra said, so you're going to put your name on it? Darnell said, I was already on it. I signed the original inspection report 6 weeks ago. I flagged the issue. My name is already in this chain. He looked at Ezra. The only question is what I do now that I'm standing at the end of it. Ezra looked at him for a long moment. He said, in 1962, after I landed that T-33, the 3 men waiting on the ground, one of them told me I had no authority to be in that aircraft, that I had violated about 6 different regulations by landing there, that there would be consequences. He paused. The second man told me I had just saved the life of the instructor in my back seat because he had a head injury and would not have survived the diversion to the primary field. He paused again. The third man said nothing. He just looked at the aircraft and then looked at me and shook his head very slowly. Darnell said, what happened? Ezra said, the first man filed a report. The second man filed a counter-report. The third man turned out. He was the base commander, called me into his office the next morning and told me that he had read both reports and that the regulations existed for good reasons and that the reasons I had broken them were also good reasons. He folded his hands and then he asked me if I would do it again. Darnell said, what did you say? Ezra said, I said yes, and he said good, because the alternative was a dead man, and regulations that produce dead men need to be looked at. Darnell sat with that. He said, the regulations didn't produce this. One man's signature did. Ezra said yes. He looked at the log, which is why the regulations need to find that signature. A voice from across the terminal, Mr. Booker? Darnell looked up. A woman was walking toward him, 50-something. Business clothes. The particular efficient walk of someone who has come from elsewhere quickly and has a job to do when she arrives. She was carrying a tablet and a messenger bag, and she was looking at Darnell with the focused attention of a person who has been told things about him and is now reconciling those things with the person in front of her. She said, I'm Carla Jackson, FAA Office of Aviation Safety. I've been assigned to this incident. She looked at the maintenance log in his hands. Is that what I think it is? Darnell said, yes. She said, can I see it? He held it out. She took it, looked at the cover, opened it, found the relevant entry. Read it once. Read it again. Her expression did not change, which told him that she was either very practiced at not showing what she was thinking or she had seen something like this before. He thought probably both. She said, come with me. He stood. She looked at Ezra. Colonel Beaumont, I've been briefed that you were a witness to the events in the cabin. We'll need a statement from you as well. Ezra said. I'll be here, she said. Thank you, Colonel. She walked. Darnell followed. She led him to a small room behind the gate counter that had been cleared for the investigation, a table, 4 chairs, a window that looked out onto the tarmac where the aircraft was still sitting, emergency vehicles now mostly gone, a single maintenance crew beginning their preliminary inspection around the engines. She set the maintenance log on the table. She set her tablet next to it. She looked at Darnell. She said, I'm going to record this. I need you to know that, he said. Fine. She said, I need to ask you some questions about what you observed during the flight and what actions you took. But first, she paused. I need to tell you something. He waited. She said, I've been with the FAA for 19 years. I have read a lot of maintenance logs. I have investigated a lot of incidents. She looked at the log. 6 weeks ago, I received an anonymous tip about a fuel feed issue on this airline's Atlanta fleet. I opened a preliminary inquiry. She looked at Darnell. I was told by my supervisor to close it. Insufficient evidence. Darnell looked at her. She said, the tip came through the general reporting system. No name attached. She held his gaze. The language in the tip was very specific, technical. The kind of specific that comes from someone who does this work. Darnell said nothing. She said, was that you? A pause. He said yes. She said, and when the inquiry was closed, he said, I let it go. She said, why? He said, because I thought the system had handled it. She said, the system had been asked to handle it. That's different. He looked at her. She said, Mr. Booker. The signature in that log, she touched the cover. That name has been in 4 previous incident reports in the last 3 years. Each time the investigation was closed before it reached formal findings. She held his gaze each time. The original concern came from a subcontractor or a junior technician with no institutional standing to push back. Darnell said, "And?" She said, "And today you are not a subcontractor with a tip in the anonymous reporting system. Today you are a man who was on an aircraft that declared a mayday. You are a man whose name is already in the original inspection report 6 weeks ago as the technician who flagged the issue. You are a material witness to the event, a first-hand observer of the maintenance log," and she paused. "And you are the person who brought that aircraft down," he said. "Jerome Ossie flew the aircraft." She said, "I've spoken to First Officer Ossie. He was very clear about the distinction between what he did and what you did." Darnell said, "We both, Mr. Booker." She said it quietly. "I'm not here to argue about credit. I'm here because 212 people are alive and an aircraft is on the ground. And there is a maintenance log on this table with a name on it that has been protected for 3 years. She looked at him. "I need your statement. I need your original inspection report from 6 weeks ago. I need everything you have," he said. "And then?" she said. "And then I'm going to open an investigation that does not get closed." He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Walter Briggs and his 26 years, and his relationships, and the way the industry arranged itself around certain names. He thought about the anonymous tip in the reporting system. He thought about no action required in someone else's handwriting under his own careful documentation. He said, "Will it matter?" She said, "That depends on what we build." He said, "The last one didn't matter." She said, "The last one didn't have this." She put her hand on the maintenance log. "Or this." She looked at him. "You are not anonymous today, Mr. Booker. Today you have a name attached to a Mayday declaration and a successful emergency landing, and 212 people who walked off that aircraft." She held his gaze. "That's a different kind of record." He sat with that. She said, "I know what this costs you. I know what going on record against a name like that costs someone in your position." She did not look away. "I also know what the alternative costs. You know it too. You've known it for 6 weeks." He said, "Yes." She said, "So?" He said, "Yes." One word. Just yes. She turned on the recorder. And Darnell Booker, aviation mechanic, Vine City, Atlanta, Georgia, began to talk. He started with the aircraft 6 weeks ago. The fuel feed pressure variation he had documented, the language he had used in his report, the flagging he had done through the formal channel. He described closing the report, opening the anonymous tip, waiting. And then this part he said without looking away from the recorder, letting it go when the inquiry was closed. He said, "I should have pushed harder." Carla said, "You were working within a system that was designed to make pushing hard very expensive for people like you." He said, "That's true, and I still should have pushed harder." She wrote something on her tablet. Then he described the flight. From the moment he boarded to the moment the wheels stopped. Every observation, every calculation, every decision. He described what he heard in the engine, and when he heard it. He described the napkin, took it out of his shirt pocket, and set it on the table. All 4 entries in his handwriting. Timestamps that aligned precisely with the instrument data the aircraft's flight recorder would show. He described standing up in the cabin. He described the cockpit, the crossfeed valve, the maintenance log entry, the name. He said the name, out loud, on the record, without qualifying it or softening it. Carla wrote it down. He described the approach, the oil pressure. Jerome calling the numbers. Cloud breaking at 100 feet. He did not describe the feeling of the wheels touching the runway, because that part was not in the category of things a person could put in a statement. That part was in a different category. The category of things that live in the body. When he finished, the room was quiet. Carla looked at what she had on her tablet. She said, "This is thorough," he said. "I spent 10 years writing incident reports." She said, "It shows." She closed the tablet, looked at him. She said, "Mr. Booker, I need to tell you something else." He waited. She said, "I've been with this investigation since the Mayday came in. I called in a lot of resources very quickly. And while I was doing that, I looked at your record." She folded her hands. "Your company record, your Air Force record, your subcontract history." He said nothing. She said, 3 years ago you applied for an FAA certification to run independent quality assurance inspections. The kind of work that would allow your operation to certify its own work without a third-party sign-off from a larger firm. He said, I was denied. She said, yes. The denial came with a note citing insufficient documentation of operational standards. She held his gaze. The reviewing official on that denial was, he said. Briggs, she said, yes. Darnell looked at his hands. He said, he blocked the certification, she said. The denial was within his authority. Technically. She paused. As were all the other things he did. Technically. That's how this works. That's why it takes this long to unwind. He said, my operation has been paying for a third-party sign-off for 3 years because I couldn't get certified to do it myself. She said, yes. He said, that sign-off goes to a firm that Briggs has a stake in. She said, I know. He looked at her. She said, the investigation I'm opening covers more than the maintenance log. He understood what she was telling him. He understood it in the specific way of a man who has been working inside a rigged system long enough to have stopped being surprised by its dimensions and started being surprised only by how completely it held. He said, what does this mean for the certification? She said, that decision is not mine, but the grounds for the original denial will be reviewed, and I will make certain that review is done by someone other than the reviewing official. He said, that's not a guarantee. She said, no, it's not. She held his gaze. Neither was standing up in that cabin. Neither was closing that valve. You did those things anyway, he said. That was different. She said, how? He thought about it. He said, on the aircraft there were 200 people and an engine losing pressure, and I knew what to do. He stopped. This is sitting in a room and putting my name on a piece of paper and hoping the system that has been working against me for 3 years decides to work. She said, yes, that's exactly what it is. Quiet. She said, do you want to know what's on the other side of it if it works? He said, tell me. She said, Briggs loses his certification authority. The firm loses its contracts. The maintenance chain for this airline gets a full independent audit. She looked at him. And every aircraft that Briggs cleared in the last 3 years gets re-inspected by people without his relationships. Darnell said, how many aircraft? She said, a lot. He thought about that. 212 people on one aircraft. A lot of aircraft. He picked up his pen. He said, what do I sign? She pulled a form from her bag. He signed it. His name, clear. His handwriting the same careful, precise script he used on every inspection report, every work order, every certification document he had ever filed. The handwriting of a man who understood that his name on paper was the only version of himself that certain rooms ever saw, so it had better be legible. He signed it. He set down the pen. Outside the window, the maintenance crew was still working around the aircraft at the end of the runway. 2 men with equipment, moving carefully, checking the things that needed checking. Doing the work, he watched them for a moment. Then he picked up his copy of the statement and folded it and put it in his pocket with the napkin. He stood up. Carla said, Mr. Booker. He looked at her. She said, what you did today on that aircraft and in this room, those are 2 different kinds of courage. He said, I don't know about that. She said, the first one is the kind people make movies about. The second one is the kind that actually changes things. He looked at her. She said, thank you for both. He nodded once. He walked out of the room. The terminal was different now. The holding area was quieter. Some passengers had already left on ground transport to hotels. Others were still there, waiting for information about alternate flights, about luggage, about what came next. The practical aftermath of a crisis, all the logistics that arrive once the crisis itself is over. He walked through it. He was almost to the far exit when Raymond Goss stepped in front of him. Not blocking, not confrontational, just there. Goss in his charcoal suit that still looked expensive despite everything the last 2 hours had put it through. Standing with his hands at his sides and his laptop bag over his shoulder, and an expression that was very different from the one he'd had when he told a man to sit down. Darnell stopped. They looked at each other. Goss said, I'm a lawyer. Darnell said, I know. I work for the airline's legal team. He paused. I was on my way to Fairbanks to handle a maintenance liability claim. Darnell said, I know. Goss said, the claim was filed by a technician who flagged a fuel system issue and was told the work wasn't needed. Darnell looked at him. Goss said, my job was to protect the airline's position, which in this case meant building the argument that the technician's report was procedurally flawed, that the sign-off was appropriate, that the liability sat with, he stopped, with people who don't have the resources to absorb it. Darnell said nothing. Goss said, I was going to win. He said it without pride. Just as a fact. I was very good at winning that kind of case. Darnell said, and now? Goss looked at his hands. The hands that had pulled a laptop bag toward himself on a plane boarding in Atlanta this morning. The hands that had pointed at a man in workwear and said, sit down, with the authority of someone who had never once been told those words himself. He said, I was on that aircraft. Darnell said, yes, I watched you walk past me to the front of that plane. He looked up. And I knew from the moment you stood up what it was going to look like. I knew the cabin was going to watch you the way the cabin watches men like you. I knew you knew it. And you stood up anyway. Darnell said, someone had to. Goss said he stopped. Started again. That's not the whole reason, and you know it. Darnell looked at him. Goss said, you stood up because 200 people needed you to. Not because they deserved it from you. Not because they had treated you like you deserved anything from them. Because they needed it. Darnell said, I stood up because I knew what the engine was doing. Goss said, and you could have known that in seat 5A for the rest of the flight. Silence. Goss said, I'm going to withdraw from the Fairbanks case. Darnell looked at him. It's conflict of interest now. I was a material witness to the event that. He paused. That's the professional reason. The other reason is. He stopped again. Seemed to be finding the sentence from somewhere it was hard to reach. I was going to help protect the chain of decisions that put 200 people on that aircraft with a known defect. And I sat across the aisle from the man who figured out what that defect was doing and fixed it. He looked at Darnell. I need to find a way to be useful to the other side of this. Darnell said, talk to Carla Jackson, FAA investigator. She's in the room at the end of the gate counter. Goss said, will she use me? Darnell said, tell her what you know about how the liability claims have been handled. Tell her the pattern. Tell her which cases were settled quietly and which ones were built to disappear. He held Goss's gaze. If you know what you say, you know she'll use you. Goss said, that will end certain professional relationships. Darnell said, I know. Goss said, I told you to sit down. Darnell said, you did, on a plane where you were the only person who could save it. Darnell said, I know that too. Goss looked at him for a long moment. He said, I'm sorry. Darnell said, go talk to Carla Jackson. Goss went. Darnell watched him go. Then he walked to the window that looked out onto the tarmac, and he stood there and he looked at the aircraft at the end of the runway. The maintenance crew still working around it, the Montana sky still gray above it. Everything still and cold and ordinary in the way that everything becomes ordinary again. Eventually, no matter what has happened inside it. He thought about the maintenance log with his name in it 6 weeks ago. He thought about the napkin in his pocket with 4 entries in his handwriting. He thought about the statement he had just signed with his full name written clearly at the bottom. He thought about the certification he had been denied 3 years ago by a man who had a stake in keeping him from getting it. He thought about 200 people getting off an aircraft that had landed softly enough that no one heard the wheels touch. He thought, you cannot sit in seat 5A and know what you know and do nothing. He had known that on the aircraft. He knew it now. The terminal hummed around him. The practical machinery of aftermath. People making arrangements. People calling home. People doing the quiet, necessary work of returning to their lives after a few hours in which their lives were not guaranteed. He stood at the window and he did not move for a long time, and then his phone buzzed. A text from the Fairbanks client. Saw the news. Heard a plane out of Atlanta had an emergency. You on that? Darnell looked at the message. He texted back. Yes. Parts fine. Can still deliver. Might be a day late. 3 dots. Then forget the deadline. You looked at that. He typed. He put his phone in his pocket. He turned away from the window. He had a statement to file. He had a Fairbanks client who needed a fuel injector seal. He had a 3-bay operation in Vine City that needed its owner to come home and open the doors on Monday morning. He had work. He picked up his maintenance log copy from where he'd set it on the window ledge. He walked toward the exit, and Renee Caldwell fell into step beside him. She had changed out of her uniform jacket into a sweater she had pulled from her carry-on. She looked different in it, still herself, but softer at the edges. The 11 years of professional composure fully down for the first time since Darnell had met her. She walked beside him, without saying anything for a moment. Then she said, the old man wanted me to tell you something. Darnell said, what? She said. He said, the kind of good that doesn't know it's good yet is the most dangerous kind. She paused. He said, You'd understand what that means. Darnell walked. He thought about it. He said, "Tell him I'm starting to," Renee said. He also said, "The next time you're on a flight and you hear something in an engine." Darnell said, "Tell him to mind his business." Renee laughed. A real one. The kind that comes from somewhere below the professional surface and doesn't ask permission before it arrives. Darnell held the door open for her. She walked through. Outside, the Montana air was cold and flat and completely indifferent to everything that had happened in the last 2 hours. The sky was the same dishwater gray. The tarmac was the same concrete. The aircraft was still sitting at the end of the runway with the maintenance crew still working around it. All of it exactly the same. And completely different. Because a name was now on a statement in a room at the end of a gate counter. Because a lawyer had turned around and gone back to talk to an investigator. Because a first officer had said, "I'll put my name on it," on a concrete barrier in the cold. Because Darnell Booker had stood up. Not once. Twice. The hotel room in Billings had one window. It faced the parking lot, not a view anyone would choose. But Darnell sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it anyway, the yellow light of the lot lamps, the cars in their rows, the ordinary stillness of a parking lot in Montana at 9 in the evening, and he let it be exactly what it was. Unremarkable. Safe. He had the maintenance log on the desk, his duffel on the floor, his hard case next to it, foam still intact, fuel injector seal still inside, still going to Fairbanks. Eventually. Once he figured out how to get there from here on an airline that currently had one of its aircraft sitting on a runway being gone over by every inspector the FAA could mobilize on short notice. He looked at his hands. He had washed them 3 times since landing. The soap in the hotel bathroom was the thin kind that came in small wrapped bars, and it had done its best, and his hands were clean the way hands get clean when the work has been in them long enough, that clean and work marked mean the same thing. He stopped looking at his hands. He lay back on the bed, boots still on, and looked at the ceiling instead. He thought about the statement he had signed. He thought about Carla Jackson's face when he said the name out loud, the way she had not reacted. Not because she didn't care, because she had been carrying the weight of that name for longer than today, and she had learned to keep her face out of it while she worked. He thought about Raymond Goss turning around and walking back toward the gate counter. He thought about 212 people. He thought it might not matter. Not cynically. Just honestly. He had been in enough systems to know that systems had a way of protecting themselves. That names with 26 years behind them had ways of surviving investigations that names with 3 years behind them did not. He thought, "You signed it anyway." He thought, yes. He closed his eyes. He was asleep in 4 minutes, which was not something he decided to do. His body decided it for him, the way bodies do after they have been running on adrenaline for 6 hours and the adrenaline has finally stopped. He dreamed about the engine, not the failing one. The sound of it before the baseline drone of a machine running right, the particular frequency of turbines at cruising altitude, the vibration in the floor that you felt before you heard it. He dreamed about listening to it the way he always listened, in the jump seat, in the maintenance bay. Through the soles of his boots on a tarmac at 4 in the morning, he woke at 2. The parking lot was the same, the ceiling was the same. The maintenance log on the desk had not moved. He got up, drank water from the tap, sat in the chair by the window and looked at the lot for a while. He thought about Ezra Beaumont. The old man had been taken to his own hotel by a ground crew escort the airline's doing, the only graceful thing the airline had managed all day. Darnell had not had a chance to speak to him after the hatch closed on the ambulance carrying Adrian. There had been too much happening. The FAA room, Carla, Goss, and then Renee walking out beside him in the cold Montana air and the conversation that ended with him needing to get to Fairbanks. He had not said goodbye to Ezra. He thought about that. He thought about a man who had flown B-52s for 31 years and worn a Tuskegee pin on his bracelet like it was just another piece of cloth. A man who had looked at Darnell in seat 5A and seen something that everyone else in that cabin had looked at and missed. He thought about what it meant to be seen by someone who knows exactly what they're looking at. He picked up his phone. He did not have Ezra's number. He texted Renee. "Is Colonel Beaumont still at the hotel?" 3 minutes. Then yes. "Same hotel as you, room 612. He gave me his number for exactly this reason. He said you'd reach out eventually, but that you'd probably wait too long." Darnell looked at that. He texted back, "It's 2 a.m. Renee, he also said he doesn't sleep much anymore. His words. Darnell sat with that for a moment. Then he took the number and called it. It rang once. Ezra said, I wondered when you'd call. Darnell said, it's 2 in the morning. Ezra said, I know what time it is. A pause. Darnell said, I didn't get a chance to say anything after. Ezra said, you were busy. Darnell said, you were the reason I stood up. Ezra said, no. Darnell said, you turned around, and Ezra said, I told you what you already knew. That's different from being the reason. A pause. The quiet of a hotel room late at night. The specific silence of a man who is used to being awake at this hour. You already knew the engine was failing. You already knew you were the only person on that aircraft who understood what it meant. You already knew what would happen if you sat there. Another pause. I just said it out loud so you had to hear it from outside your own head. Darnell said nothing. Ezra said, that's not the same as being the reason. Darnell said, what's the difference? Ezra said, the difference is that when I'm gone you still have it. Whatever I gave you tonight stays when I leave. But if I was the reason, if you only stood up because an old man told you to, then the next time there's something you need to stand up for, you're waiting for another old man. A pause. I'm not always going to be on the plane, Darnell said. You're going to Anchorage. Ezra said tomorrow. They rebooked me on a morning flight. A pause. Ceremony's on Thursday. I've been waiting 60 years for this particular ceremony. I'm not missing it because of a fuel valve. Darnell said, what's the ceremony? Ezra was quiet for a moment. Then he said, there are 11 of us left. 11 men who flew under the red tail. The youngest is 74. The oldest is 91. A pause. The Anchorage Veterans Council is giving us a formal recognition. Not the first time we've been recognized, but possibly the last time all 11 of us can be in the same room. His voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness there was something that Darnell understood to be the weight of knowing a thing is ending. I want to look at those 10 men one more time. In the same room. All of us still here. Darnell said, you'll make it. Ezra said, I know I will. No doubt in it. I've been making things on time for 78 years. I'm not stopping now. A pause. Darnell said, I found something in the maintenance log. Ezra said, I know. Renee told me. Darnell said, the FAA investigator has it. Ezra said, good. Darnell said, it might not go anywhere. Ezra said, it might not. Darnell said, I signed my name to it. Ezra said, I know. A pause. What does that feel like? Darnell thought about it. He said, like being on a runway in the dark. Not knowing if the instruments are right. Ezra said, and? Darnell said, and trusting them anyway, because you don't have a better option. Ezra said, that's exactly what it feels like. A pause. And you know what happens when you trust the instruments? Darnell said, sometimes you land, sometimes you don't. Ezra said, every time I flew into weather I couldn't see through, I trusted the instruments. Every time. His voice was quiet and absolutely certain. And here I am, 78 years old, going to Anchorage to sit in a room with 10 men who made it too. A pause. The instruments don't lie, son. People lie. Systems lie. But the instruments, the actual truth of a thing that doesn't lie. You found the truth in that log and you put your name on it. He paused. The rest is navigation. Darnell said, navigation. Ezra said, you know where you're trying to go. You know what the instruments are telling you. You navigate from here. A pause. That's all flying ever was. That's all any of it ever is. Silence. Then Darnell said, thank you for turning around. Ezra said, thank you for standing up. A pause. Ezra said, get some sleep. You have a part to deliver. Darnell said, yes, sir. He ended the call. He sat in the chair by the window for a while longer. The parking lot was the same. Yellow light. Still cars, Montana doing what Montana did at 2 in the morning, which was nothing, which was exactly what he needed from it. He went back to the bed. This time he slept straight through to 6. He got to Fairbanks the following afternoon. One connection through Seattle. Different aircraft. Different seat 7C aisle, because the window seats were taken, and he had not fought for one. He sat down, buckled his belt, and listened to the engines at startup. They sounded fine. He noted it and let it go. The man next to him did not move his bag when Darnell sat down. Small thing, true thing. Darnell noticed it the way he always noticed things, and filed it in the place where noticed things went and looked out the window across the empty middle seat at the tarmac below, and thought about nothing in particular for most of the flight. Percy Okafor met him at the Fairbanks terminal. 50-something. Practical coat. The look of a man who had been in commercial aviation maintenance in Alaska long enough to have no patience for anything that wasn't exactly what it was. He shook Darnell's hand. Said, "You're the mechanic from the flight." Darnell said, "I'm the mechanic with your fuel injector seal." Percy looked at him for a moment, said both. He handed over the hard case. Percy opened it, checked the part, checked the foam, checked the documentation, signed the invoice without discussion. They stood in the terminal with the Alaska November pressing against the glass. Percy said, "Briggs." Darnell said, "The FAA has it." Percy said, "I know. Carla Jackson called me this morning." He looked at Darnell. "I've been trying to get someone to look at that chain for 2 years. Filed 3 separate complaints through the standard channel. Nothing came back." He paused. "You put your name on it and it moved in one day." Darnell said, "It moved because enough people put their names on it." Percy said, "It moved because you went first." He held Darnell's gaze. "In my experience, the first name is the one that costs the most. Every name after that is cheaper because the first one already paid." Darnell said nothing. Percy said, "I've been looking for a quality assurance contractor. 8 months. Someone with real experience and no connections to the Atlanta maintenance chain." He paused. "When your certification comes through." Darnell said, "Hasn't come through." Percy said, "When it does." A pause. Darnell said, "Call me." Percy said, "Count on it." He flew home that evening. Atlanta from above at night was the city he had always known from this angle, spread and lit, and going in every direction without apologizing for its scale. He had flown into Hartsfield enough times that the approach felt like a sentence he had memorized. The specific sequence of lights and highways, and the dark gaps that were parks or water, or the neighborhoods that didn't have enough light to show from above. He took a cab to Vine City, unlocked the shop, stood in the doorway, 3 bays. His employees' toolboxes along the wall, the work orders in the plastic sleeve on the desk, the smell of the place, metal and solvent, and the specific weight of a workspace that had been a workspace long enough to smell like one permanently. He turned on the lights, went to the desk, opened the work orders. 4 jobs waiting. He picked up the first one and read it and set it back down and did not start it. Not tonight. Tonight he just stood in his shop and let it be his shop around him, and that was enough. He went home. He slept. He came in the next morning at 7, and Darius and Keisha were already there, and nobody said anything about billings for the first hour and a half, which was the right call, and they both knew it was the right call, which was why he had hired them. Then Keisha said, "My mother called." Darnell said, "Bay 1. Keisha said, "She wanted me to tell you something." He looked at her. She said she's been on planes her whole life, since she was small. She always told herself that if something went wrong, there was a trained person prepared for it. She stopped. Started again. She said now she knows that sometimes the person who knows is just the person sitting next to you. A pause. She said, "Thank you for being that person and for not staying in the seat." Darnell said, "Tell her she's welcome." He went to Bay 1. The work steadied him the way it always had. Not because it was easy, because it was real. Because the gap between a system functioning correctly and a system about to fail was not a matter of opinion or politics or who had the right relationships. It was a matter of what the instruments said, what the tolerances were, what the maintenance log showed. The work did not negotiate with itself. It just was what it was and asked you to meet it there. He met it there, 3 days of meeting it there. On the 4th day, Carla Jackson called. She said, "The investigation is formally open." He said, "What does formally mean?" She said, "It has a case number, a team. Resources I did not have to argue for because Raymond Goss spent 4 hours in a room with my supervisor explaining the liability claim pattern in detail that only someone inside the airline's legal operation would have." A pause. "Briggs's certification authority is suspended pending investigation." He said, "Suspended," she said, "for now. The revocation process takes longer. But suspended means nothing he signs is valid until this is resolved. Which means everything he was supposed to sign next week, next month, it all stops." He said, "And the aircraft?" She said, 61 aircraft with Briggs sign-offs in the last 36 months are being pulled for re-inspection, starting with the highest hours since last sign-off. He sat with that number. 61. Not one aircraft with 212 people. 61 aircraft, each one full. Each one with a fuel line or a valve or a pressure reading that someone had flagged, and Briggs had cleared with 2 words and a signature. He said, "How long for the inspections?" She said, 6 months minimum. They'll find some that are clean and some that aren't. A pause. The ones that aren't will tell us how many flights they've already flown since the deficiency was cleared, he said. And the certification denial. She said, separate process. Different team. I cannot make you a promise about timing. She paused. I can tell you that the team reviewing it has no professional overlap with Briggs's network, which is the most important variable, he said. That's not a guarantee, she said. No. A pause. Darnell. I want to say something to you. He waited. She said, I've been with the FAA for 19 years. I have read a lot of maintenance logs. I have opened a lot of investigations, and I have had a lot of them closed before they reached anything because the name at the center of them had better protection than the evidence against them. She was careful, exact. The way she was in the room in Billings. The mechanism that was being used to block your certification is now the subject of a federal investigation. That mechanism cannot be used again while the investigation is open. And when the investigation closes, if it closes the way the evidence is pointing, that mechanism will not exist anymore. He said, You're telling me to be patient. She said, I'm telling you that the wall that was in your way is currently being taken apart. A pause. Brick by brick is slower than all at once. But it's the same wall. He said, okay. She said, okay. He said, I've been patient for 3 years. I can't keep going. She said, call me if anything changes on your end. He said, you'll hear from me. He put the phone in his pocket and went back to Bay 2 and picked up where he had left off and did not think about the investigation for the rest of the day because thinking about it did not make it move faster, and the work in front of him was real and present and asked for his actual attention. He gave it his actual attention. 2 weeks passed. He was in Bay 1 on a Thursday morning, working a certification inspection that was more straightforward than he had expected. Clean aircraft. Clean Someone had been doing the work right when his phone buzzed on the workbench. Unknown number. Atlanta area code. He picked up. A woman's voice. Measured. The voice of someone who had spent time learning which words to use and had learned it well. She said, Mr. Booker, my name is Adrian Fouché. He set down the tool he was holding. He said, Captain Fouché. She said, Adrian. He said, Adrian. She said, they tell me you've been correcting people when they call you a pilot. He said, I'm a mechanic. She said, you flew my aircraft. He said, I operated some of the controls while your first officer managed the systems and the checklist and the radios. A pause. She said, Jerome told me you said that. He said, it's accurate. She said, Jerome also told me that when the oil pressure on engine 1 started dropping, you made a call he wouldn't have known to make, and that when we broke out at 100 feet, you were on centerline by 3 feet. A pause. On a single-engine approach, in a crosswind, in a type you had never flown. He said nothing. She said, 3 feet, Darnell. He said, Jerome called every number. She said, I know what Jerome did. A pause. I spent an hour on the phone with him. He was very clear about the distinction between what he contributed and what you contributed. He was also very clear that he wanted me to understand that distinction before I talked to you, because he said you would try to minimize it. Darnell said, he's a good first officer. She said, he's going to be a good captain. A pause. How are you? He said, working. You? She said, cleared for limited activity. Not yet. Her voice was steady. The steadiness of someone who has spent time with difficult news and arrived somewhere past the worst of it. There's an evaluation next month, neurology, cardiology. They'll decide then. He said, I'm sorry. She said, don't be. A pause. I've been a pilot for 12 years. I know the difference between setbacks that end things and setbacks that redirect them. I don't know yet which one this is. She said it plainly, without drama. I called because there are things I want to say to you that don't work well over the phone. He said, like what? She said, like thank you, properly, in a way that requires being in the same room. A pause. I'm in Atlanta next week. I know a place on Auburn Avenue I've been thinking about for a while. Come to dinner, he said. You don't owe me. She said, I know what I owe. I'll decide what I give. And there it was, the edge of something warm in it. Not performed. Just present. Tuesday. 7. I'll text you the address, he said. Okay, she said. Darnell. He said, yeah. She said, what you did on that aircraft and what you did in that room afterward, those aren't the same kind of thing. One of them happened in 90 minutes of crisis. The other one you chose when you had time to think about the cost. A pause. I want you to know that I understand the difference. He said, most people don't. She said, I'm not most people. He believed her. She ended the call. He stood in Bay 1 with the phone in his hand and looked at the aircraft in front of him. Clean log, well maintained. Someone had been doing the work right, systematically, over time, without waiting for a crisis to make it urgent. That was the job. That was always the job. He put his phone in his chest pocket and picked up his tool and went back to the inspection. Tuesday came. Auburn Avenue at 7 in the evening was the version of itself. He liked best foot traffic thinning into the dinner hour, the restaurants lit and warm behind their windows, the street carrying its history, the way streets that have been through things carry it, not loudly, just present in the way old things are present. He found the restaurant. She was already there. Of course she was already there. Corner table, near the window but not directly in it. Out of uniform dark slacks, a fitted blouse, the color of deep burgundy, a coat over the back of her chair, her hair down, not pulled back the way it had been under her captain's cap, full and straight around her face, framing it differently than the version of her he had glimpsed for 3 seconds in that cockpit seat. She looked up when he came through the door. Found him immediately. No scanning the room. Just found him. Dark eyes, direct. The kind of eyes that have read instruments in high-pressure moments and learned not to look away when they need information. He walked to the table. She stood. They were nearly the same height, which surprised him. And they stood for a moment, with the slightly careful calibration of two people who have shared something large and are now meeting each other in the ordinary configuration of the world for the first time. He said, "Captain." She said, "Adrian." He said, "Adrian." She said, "Sit down." He sat. She looked at his hands on the table. He said, "I washed them." She said, "I wasn't going to say anything about it." He said, "You were looking." She said, "I was." She held his gaze. "I wanted to see them," he said. "They're mechanics' hands," she said. "Yes. Like it settled something." "That's exactly what they are." The food came she had ordered before he arrived, which should have been presumptuous and somehow was not, because she had ordered right. Quiet competence. The same thing that ran through everything she did, the way it ran through the best crews he had ever worked alongside. She wrapped both hands around her water glass. She said, "Tell me about Vine City." He looked at her. She said, "The operation, 3 years, tell me." So he told her. He told her about coming out of the Air Force with a specific idea and a toolkit and not much else. About the first year, which was mostly learning the difference between being good at work and being good at running a business, which were entirely different skills and only one of which he had arrived with. He told her about Darius and Keisha, about the loan and the equipment and the certification denials that came with careful language that never named what they were actually doing. He told her about the tip 6 weeks ago, and letting it go. She listened the way she had listened to Jerome, full attention, no interrupting, eyes on him. When he finished, she said, "You let it go because the cost of not letting it was too visible." He said, "Yes," she said. "And then you got on an aircraft where the cost of letting it go was right in front of you." He said, 212 people. She said, "Yes." She looked at her glass. "I understand that calculation. I have been making it for 12 years every time. Which walls to push and which ones to wait beside and which ones to find another path around." She looked at him. "You get very precise at it. And sometimes you get so precise at it that you forget to ask whether the precision should be required." He said, "What changed it for you?" She said, "I got my route. Simply. 11 months ago, I flew my first trip as captain and I sat in the left seat. And I thought I did 12 years of this math and I am here. And then I thought, the next woman who wants this seat should not have to do 12 years of this math." A pause. "So I started pushing walls I had been walking around." He said, "Is that why you called Carla Jackson?" She said, "I called Carla Jackson because it's my aircraft and my investigation and I have standing, and yes, that's also why." She held his gaze. "You didn't have to sign that statement," he said. "I know." She said, "Neither did Jerome. Neither did Goss, for that matter." He said, "Goss had reasons." She said, "Everyone had reasons. You went first." A pause. "The first name on something like that, that's the one that costs. Every name after is cheaper because the first one already absorbed what it cost." He said, "Percy Okafor said something like that." She said, "Percy Okafor is a smart man." He almost smiled. They ate. They talked. Not about the flight, or not only about it. About the work. About what it meant to spend your life inside machines that most people only experienced from the outside. About the gap between what a system looks like from a distance and what it actually is when you're inside it. She said, "When I was at Embry-Riddle, My first simulator instructor told me not unkindly. He wasn't a cruel man. He told me that the path from where I was to where I wanted to be was long, and the industry was not built to carry me there quickly. He said, "What did you do?" she said. I thanked him for being honest, and I went back to the simulator and I flew it until I was better than anyone in my cohort. A pause. And then I was still slower than everyone else getting to captain. Because the system was not built to carry me there quickly, exactly like he said. She looked at him. "But I got there." He said, "Yes," she said. "And now I'm sitting in an Atlanta restaurant with a man who landed my aircraft when I couldn't, and who signed his name to a statement that is currently dismantling the maintenance chain that put us both in that situation." She looked at him steadily. "The system is slow. It is frustrating. It is not built for us." A pause. "But it moves. When enough people push it, it moves." He said, "You sound certain." She said, "I am certain, not arrogant, just the conviction of someone who has tested the proposition and found it to be true. I have 12 years of evidence." He looked at her across the table. She looked back. And in the looking, the direct, unperformed, unhurried quality of it, there was something that was not the residue of shared crisis. Something that had been present since the moment she found him across the restaurant, without scanning the room. Something that knew what it was and was not in any hurry about it. He said, "You're going to be a lot of work." She said, "I'm sorry?" He said, "As a person to know. A lot of work." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You spent 10 years listening to engines tell you what they needed before anyone else could hear them. You spent 3 years building something that everyone around you quietly assumed wouldn't make it. And then you got on a plane and heard something and stood up in front of people telling you to sit down." She looked at him directly. "You specialize in things that are a lot of work." He said, "Fair." She said, "Yes." He said, "Same time next week." She said, "I was going to suggest that." He said, "I know." She looked at him. He said, "You already knew I was going to say it." She said, "I had a reasonable estimate." He said, "That's almost the same as knowing." She said, "Almost." The warmth in it again. "Not performing anything. Just there. Ask me again next week and we'll see." He walked her to her car. The Auburn Avenue night was cold and clear, and the street was quieter now. The dinner hour winding down. The city doing what it did, when the daytime version of itself gave way to the late version. She stopped at the driver's side door and turned to face him. She said, "Darnell." He said, "Yeah." She said, "What you did on the aircraft, and what you did in that room. I told you on the phone that they're two different kinds of thing." A pause. "I want you to know that in 12 years I have met a lot of people who could do the first kind. Crisis brings it out. People surprise themselves." She looked at him. "The second kind, choosing it when you have time to see the cost, that's rarer." He said, "You did the second kind." She said, "Yes. So did Jerome, so did Goss in the end." She paused. "But you went first, and going first when you're the one who has the most to lose." She stopped. Found the words. "That doesn't come from training. That comes from something else." He said, "What?" She said, "From knowing who you are." She held his gaze. "You knew on that aircraft. You knew in that room. I think you've known for a long time and just had enough people telling you otherwise that you'd stopped being sure." He said nothing. She said, "You can be sure now." She got in her car. He stood on Auburn Avenue and watched the taillights until they turned the corner. Then he stood there a moment longer. He thought about an old man in seat 4C who had turned around and seen him. He thought about a fuel valve closed in time. He thought about a name signed at the bottom of a statement. He thought about 3 years of certification denials and the specific language used in each one, and the name behind that language and what it would mean when that name was finally attached to what it had actually been doing. He thought, "The instruments don't lie." He went home. The certification letter arrived on a Wednesday, 6 weeks after billings. He was in Bay 2 when Darius brought it from the desk. Darius had the look of someone who had seen the return address and understood that this piece of mail was categorically different from the other pieces of mail, and had brought it over without saying anything about it, because some things you just bring over without editorializing. He handed it to Darnell and went back to Bay 1. Darnell stood in Bay 2 with the envelope in his hand. He opened it. Read it again. The language was the language of government documents, structured and formal, and using 12 words where 4 would do, but the meaning was clear. The denial issued to Booker Aviation Services had been reviewed under new administrative authority. The grounds for the original denial had been found to reflect a compromised review process. The application for Independent Quality Assurance Certification had been approved. Effective immediately, he stood in Bay 2 for a while. Not with triumph, not with relief exactly, with something quieter than either of those. Something that felt like what it actually was, which was 3 years of building something in the right direction finally arriving at the place it had been heading. He took out his phone, called Adrian. She answered immediately. He said the certification came through. She said, I know. He said, Carla called you. She said she called me first. A pause. Something in her voice that she was not organizing into words yet. Darnell. He said, yeah. She said, I want you to hear this clearly. Her voice was steady, direct. What you built in Vine City was always good enough. The certification being denied was never about whether your operation met the standard. It was about a man using his authority to protect his own financial interest by blocking someone who would have competed with it. A pause. You didn't finally earn this. You were owed it 3 years ago. He looked at the letter. He said, I know. She said, do you? A pause. He said, I'm getting there. She said, get there. No softness in it. Just conviction. Because when Percy Okafor calls you next week and offers you that Fairbanks contract, I need you to walk into that conversation knowing exactly what your operation is worth. Not what the system spent 3 years telling you it was worth. A pause. Can you do that? He said. Percy already said he'd call. She said, I know. He called me too. A pause. I gave him a reference. He said, you don't know my work. She said, I know what your work produced. I'm alive. 211 other people are alive. The maintenance chain that was compromising aircraft across 61 tail numbers is being dismantled. A pause. I know your work, he said, thank you. She said, don't thank me, call Percy. A pause, and come to dinner Thursday. I'm cooking this time, he said. You cook? She said, I fly aircraft. I think I can manage dinner, he said. Those are not the same skill, she said. Thursday. 7. Don't be late. He said, I won't. He put the phone in his pocket, looked at the letter in his hand. He walked to the desk and put it in the drawer, not the pending drawer, not the completed drawer, but the good drawer, the one he had cleared out 6 months ago for things that needed to be kept somewhere he could find them. He called to Keisha and Darius. They came out of their bays and stood in the center of the shop, and he told them. He did not make a speech about it. He showed them the letter and told them what it meant, practically more contracts available, more scope of work, the Fairbanks conversation with Percy, what would need to change in their operation to absorb the growth responsibly. Keisha said, how long until we need another hire? He said, 6 months if the Fairbanks contract comes through. Maybe 4. Darius said, I know someone. Former Air Force. Good hands, Darnell said. Send me the name. Darius went back to Bay 1. Keisha stayed. She looked at him for a moment. She said 3 years. He said 3 years. She said, my first week here I asked you if you thought we'd make it. You said you didn't know, but we were going to do the work right and see. She held his gaze. We did the work right, he said. Yes. She said, that's the whole thing, isn't it? He said, that's the whole thing. She went back to Bay 1. He stood in the center of the shop for a moment, his shop certified. He went back to Bay 2 and finished the job he was in the middle of. Because the job was there, and it had been waiting, and the certification letter didn't change what the work asked from him, which was his attention and his accuracy, and the same hands that had been meeting this work for 3 years. He gave it those things. He gave it all of those things. 2 years and 4 months after Billings, Jerome Ossie flew his first trip as captain. Atlanta to Seattle. Morning departure. A regional expansion the airline had announced 8 months earlier. New routes, new seats, and with them, new captains promoted from the right seat ahead of the normal timeline because the schedule had to be covered. Jerome was ready. He had been ready for a while if he was being honest with himself. And he was these days more honest with himself than he had been before a Wednesday morning in Montana when a man in workwear had walked into his cockpit and looked at the instruments for 10 seconds and said 4 words that changed everything. Fuel crossfeed valve, close it. 4 words, 90 seconds of trusting them. Jerome had thought about those 90 seconds many times in the 2 years since. Not obsessively, not with anxiety, but the way you think about the moments that show you something about yourself you had not previously confirmed. He ran his pre-flight checks in the precise order he ran them every time. Systems, weather, crew briefing, and then the maintenance log. He opened it, read it, every entry, every sign-off, every notation and its corresponding clearance. The way that Darnell had shown him, not by explaining it, but by doing it, by standing in that cockpit and opening the log and reading it with the attention of someone who understood that the truth of a machine was in its records if you knew what to look for. Jerome knew what to look for now. He read the log front to back, found nothing wrong. Which was the point? Which was what you were supposed to find: nothing wrong. Everything current. Every flagged item resolved by someone who had looked at it properly and signed their name to it truthfully. He closed the log, looked out the cockpit window at the ground crew moving on the tarmac below. The fuel truck, the baggage handlers, the jetwake crew. All of them doing the work that made this possible. All of them doing it right today on this aircraft. He picked up his phone, texted Darnell, "First trip as captain today. Read the log front to back, everything clean." He watched the 3 dots appear. Then, "How's it feel?" Jerome thought about that. He thought about what Darnell had said to him on the barrier in Billings. The next time you're in that seat and it gets hard, you remember today. You remember what you're made of. He texted back, "Like I know where I'm going. 1 more dot, then good, fly it right." Jerome put the phone away. His first officer, 27, sharp. The particular energy of someone still building toward their own version of this moment, looked over and said, "Ready, Captain?" Jerome looked at the instrument panel, at the maintenance log closed on the side panel, at the tarmac below and the sky above and the route ahead. He said, "Ready," and he took the aircraft home.